Hi, Julmi from My Square Hat. Today I want to show you how I made the moss or linen stitch square that I work it in the round with an invisible join. So let's get right into it. I'm working with Finna Story, which is a cotton bamboo blend and a 6mm crochet hook. So we're going to make a magic loop. As part of the magic loop, that little chain 1, which is just part of the loop. Now we are going to make a single crochet. I prefer to place a stitch marker in my first stitch, just makes life easier. And then the pattern states chain 2 and single 3 times, so let's do that. Chain 2, single, that's 1 time. Chain 2, single, second time. Chain 2, single, the third time. Then the pattern says chain 1. We are going to close our magic loop, and instead of that extra chain 1 to make the chain 2 space, what we're going to do is we're going to slip stitch into this first single crochet. So that slip stitch effectively forms part of our corner chain 2. There's our slip stitch. There we go. That's the first round done. Now, if we were to change color, we would do it now on the chain 1. If you're doing a solid color, you would chain 1, which is not counted, and single crochet. Chain 2 and single crochet in that same space. But I'm going to show you how to do the color change as well. So there's our slip stitch. If you were to do 2 colors or 3 colors, this is where you would change between your colors. So let's get a nice contrast color, and we're going to simply drape it over and chain 1. Now, if you're using a different color, I always tighten that little loop of the first color. And now we are going to single in that chain 2 space. I always single over this tail end in this round to secure it nicely. So there is our single crochet. Now, placing the marker seems irrelevant because we have a contrast color, but I'm still just doing it. If you're doing it with a single color, then this is how you would do it. Okay, chain 2 and single in that same space. Now the pattern says chain 1, skip 1, and then we repeat the single, chain 2, single, and the chain 1. So we are going to do chain 1 and skip 1. Now the last chain 1 we will replace with a slip stitch. I'll show you now. We are going to do our corner single, chain 2, single, chain 1 and skip 1 in that corner space, single, chain 2 and single in that same space. We still have 1 corner, so we're going to chain 1, and in that corner, which is formed by the chain and the slip stitch, so that's your chain and there's your slip stitch, we are going to do a single, chain 2 and a single. Now instead of a chain to go across this single, we are going to slip stitch into our first single crochet. So this slip stitch now will be the gap that we single crochet in. So just pulling that tail a little bit tighter. I'm dropping my contrast color to the left and picking up my main color just from behind. So dropping this one to your left and picking up the main color. Now we're going to chain 1 with that main color, tighten your contrast color. This is not necessary if you're working with only one color. Now into the first corner space, going to do a single, chain 2 and a single, single, oopsie, sorry about that, single, chain 2 and a single. Now if this was one color, I would really put that stitch marker in the single, but because we're working in 2 colors, it's kind of easy to see. So now we are going to do chain 1 and skip 1, chain 1 and skip 1, then we do single, chain 1, skip 1, single in that space, chain 1 and skip the last single. Now in the corner, now we're repeating this around, except the last chain we are replacing with the slip stitch. So in the corner, do your single, chain 2 and single, then chain 1 and skip 1, chain 1, there's your single to skip, single in this next space, chain 1 to skip, and now we do the corner, single, chain 2 and single, chain 1 to skip, single in that space, chain 1 to skip, and in our last corner, there's the corner space, we do our single, chain 2 and single, and then chain 1 to skip a stitch. Now our last single, chain 1, that we do the single and the chain 1 replace with a slip stitch. Now to make it very neat, instead of going just under your slip stitch, I prefer going into that space where the slip stitch went into. So it's basically the top of this stitch, but it's sitting towards the right. So there, and then what happens is if I go at the back, I capture that yarn that's coming up to this round. So there's my single. Now instead of chaining 1 to skip this stitch, we do our slip stitch into our first single slip stitch. Now drop your working yarn to the left and pick up your contrast yarn on the right. Chain 1 and tighten that loop slightly, then single, chain 2, single, chain 1 and skip 1, and then it's single, chain 1, repeat that across. So it's single, chain 1, skip 1, single, chain 1, skip 1. Now in the next rounds it will be a few times more. In our corner we do single, chain 2 and single. You repeat this around, so chain 1 to go over your single and single into your chain 1 space of the previous round, placing a single and 2 chains in each corner. You carry on until the right amount of rounds or until you have a blanket. This is there's infinite possibilities. So chain 1 and skip that stitch. Now going our last single crochet into the slip stitch. I just want to show that to you again. There is our slip stitch, those 2 loops with our slip stitch. If we go in there, then we'll see that extra piece of yarn. So where that yarn goes in, that's where you want to insert your hook. Make sure at the back not to capture your loose yarn, but simply to go under that strand of yarn that you've pulled up to this round. So single, instead of chaining one, we slip stitch into that first single and drop our yarn to the left, pick up our first color and chain one. Now tighten that loop slightly, and this is how we repeat as many rounds as we want to. Thanks for joining me. Hope you learned something new today.